Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN on this Friday afternoon. Delighted that you're with us. This is our program for non-Catholics, those of you who are listening to a Catholic radio station, by golly. And yet here we are, and we're here to answer your questions about the Catholic faith. Many non-Catholics listen to Catholic radio, and y'all want some answers as to, well, why do Catholics believe in this, but they don't believe in this over here? Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. My recommendation is call early because it's Friday. Phones tend to fill up rather quickly on a Friday afternoon. 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response, then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. You can also shoot us an email if you prefer that, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Ace McKay is our producer today. Matt Gabinski handling the phones, Rich Jesse on social media. And that means that if you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we're streaming on both those platforms right now. Just put your question in the comments box, if you would, please. And then we'll hopefully get that question answered today. Again, that phone number, 833-288-EWTN. I'm Tom Price, along with this guy right here, Dr. David Anders.
Hey, Tom. How you doing?
Very well. How are you, my friend?
Yeah, I'm doing decent. Thank you.
Weekend plans for the Anders family?
Just chasing children.
Kind of a full-time gig, isn't it?
It is.
All right. We're going to lead off with this question from Chris in Connecticut. Hi, Tom and Dr. Anders. I know we are not promised a perfectly joyful existence here on earth, but I do question if I could do a better job of manage my own worries. I also wonder at what point unnecessary worry becomes sinful. I appreciate any guidance and thoughts on this. Thanks, Chris in Connecticut.
Yeah, so one thing I would advise, by the way, I appreciate the question, and I'm sensitive to your concerns. I would strongly advise against worrying about your worrying. Right? You can get into a recursive worrying loop. And so, personally, I think the whole concern about whether you're in sin for worrying just adds yet another layer of things to worry about, and I want to spare you all of that.
Good, good.
So, obviously there can be issues that are not theological or theoretical going on here. There can be psychological issues, that have to do with habits from childhood and maladaptive thinking patterns and this kind of stuff that maybe ought to be dealt with in therapy or something and not through a theology show. But from the theological point of view, the perspective represented by the Serenity Prayer, even though it's not a traditional Catholic prayer, man, is it Catholic in intent. I mean, It is good stuff, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't know it, God grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It's credited to the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, and it's very popular in 12-step programs. But goodness gracious, is it not a good prayer for everybody? And it's really comes right out of the mouth of Christ, who said, Lord, take this cup from me, but not my will, but thine be done. And the Blessed Virgin Mary didn't even bother with take this cup from me. She just said, thine will be done. Right? Just be it done to me according to thy word.
Yeah.
And reality is what it is, regardless of whether you want it to be or not, right? And the truth of the matter is the scope of things over which you have any kind of direct control is pretty much limited to your own interior life, your thinking and acting, basically the life of virtue.
Okay.
And outside of that, nothing lies within your control. I mean, certainly not other people. I mean, heavens, you can't control other people at all, not at all, right?
No.
And even less the weather, right, or the economy, or the political situation, or your future health, or what have you. And so, the sooner we can recognize that we have no control over these things, and that whatever happens to us as Christians, we believe ultimately comes from the good hand of God, and to surrender to divine providence is meritorious.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, to do that, not only does it bring some measure of peace of mind, and I think it's the only path to sanity, but it's actually meritorious.
Yes, indeed. And so there you go, Chris in Connecticut. Be not afraid. Here's a question now from John. Dr. Anders, why is the theory of pre-existence of the soul incompatible with Catholic beliefs?
Well, it's. I mean, I'm wondering if this is a trick question because the Catholic Church says it's wrong, right? I mean, ultimately, that's why.
Okay.
Now, there's a lot of reasons. There's arguments that you can give for it. But at the end of the day, if God had wanted to create pre-existent souls and then enflesh them, he certainly could have. He didn't do it that way. And some of the entailments of the denial of the doctrine, I think, one is a real appreciation for the physicality and the finality of human life. This is it, buddy. This body that you have is you. You are your body. You are your body. And the church has a very high regard for the body, and we have such a high regard for it, in fact, that we claim that the body is the subject of the redemption. This is why we confess resurrection of the body, belief in the future resurrection of the body, the resurrection of Christ's body. What you do with bodies matters. Your body, somebody else's body. And so there you have it. Now, there are also implications for how we interact with the world. I mean, if you think that you are your body and say the way you perceive and understand and relate to the world is through bodily organs, you're going to take things like empiricism seriously, right? And you're not going to end up in, say, Cartesian rationalism or Cartesian dualism.
Wow.
Right, and those are going to have in turn ethical implications. So, and then finally, I mean, just at the empirical level, I mean, we don't have direct experiences of our own soul. We have, the soul is something that we infer from its activity, but its activity is rational, but it's also embedded in a bodily medium, and it kind of shuts on and off in its activity with brain states, and all that would seem to militate against a radical dualism.
John, thanks so much for your email. In a moment, we'll get to the phones and talk with Christy in Venice, Florida. A couple lines open for you as well. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion.
He was a bishop, apologist, and patron of the Catholic press.
Matthew Bunson and the Doctors of the Church.
St. Francis de Sales preached in the area of Geneva for many years and used broadsheets and gentle apologetics to convert the Calvinists of the region. By the time of his death in 1622, tens of thousands had come back to the Church. He was named patron of the Catholic press in 1923 and a doctor of the Church in 1877.
To find out more, visit EWTN.com and click on Catholicism.
Teresa Tomeo and Italy's Shrines and Wonders.
For a unique day trip from Rome, travel just 30 minutes south to Castel Gandolfo. This village is among the Castel Romani, a group of wine-producing towns, and is less than 15 miles south of the Eternal City. Castel Gandolfo is known for serving as the former summer holiday home of the popes. Pope Benedict was the last pontiff to stay at this papal palace here before Pope Francis opened it up to the public. In addition to visiting the place and expansive papal gardens, make sure to stop in St. Thomas of Villanova Church in the town's main piazza, rebuilt by Bernini in the mid-17th century. And before leaving, send a postcard or two to friends back home from Castel Gandolfo and drop them in Italy's oldest mailbox and the first mailbox, which was built in 1820.
Italy's Shrines and Wonders by Teresa Tomeo is available now at EWTNRC.com.
It's Call to Communion on this Friday afternoon here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 3 lines open right now. 833-288-3986. You know, we are on probably a bazillion different social platforms, and one of those is the MyTuner app. If you've got it on your phone, you can listen to EWTN Radio's live stream. Just open up the MyTuner app, search EWTN, and you are good to go. All right, here's a very timely question. This is from Juliana. She says, a friend's spouse wants to know why we abstain from red meat. Why is it this meat? This person is not Catholic. Thanks, Juliana.
Okay, so It's not just red meat.
No, it's not.
It's not just red meat. It's all meat except fish. All right, and honestly, it's a little bit arbitrary. And the whole point of abstention is to sacrifice something that's luxurious.
Right.
And honestly, I think if the Catholic Church were going to begin today, and we were going to take our starting point from today's culture, we might come up with a different list of things to abstain from, because the culture of luxury and indulgence is so different now than it was, say 15 centuries ago, when sugar didn't exist in the Latin diet until the discovery of the Americas, the conquest of the Americas and the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and things like this. And so fatty meat was kind of it. That was sort of the luxury item, and it was give this up to subject the body to some difficulty and so forth.
So a nice lobster tail with drawn butter, not much of a penance.
Not much of a penance, there's a funny factoid. I forget which South American country it was, but when the Jesuits were down there evangelizing the indigenous population, and they said, well, it's Lent, so you have to abstain from meat, and the indigenous Christians said, well, it doesn't mean any flesh. They said, no, if it comes out of the water, you can eat it. If it comes out of the water, you can eat it. But if it comes on land, you can't eat it. And they said, aha, capybaras come out of the water. And you know what a capybara is?
I don't.
Capybara is this ginormous rodent. I mean, it's huge. It's like Labrador Retriever size. They're
rodents of unusual size.
Rodents of unusual size.
All
They're
right.
massive. You could have quite a barbecue with a capybara. But they said we could eat what comes out of the water. So in that, I can't forget which country it is. But in that culture, I was reading an article on this some years ago. They still have a Lenten practice of sitting down to barbecued capybara.
Wow.
But I think today, if you really wanted to take the spirit of the thing even farther, you would probably give up sugar first. And
Sure.
Meat would maybe be on the list for some people, and for others of us, that wouldn't be much of a stretch.
Yes, indeed. Juliana, thanks so much for your email. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We're going to begin today with Ed. Ed is in Bluefield, West Virginia, listening on YouTube. Hello, Ed. What's on your mind today, sir?
Good afternoon, and thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I was interested this morning. I was watching the prayer breakfast, and the Vice President, J.D. Vance, was on there. And I was just wondering what kind of things a politician would have to do as far as conscience versus policy in a situation with what goes on down at the border. Now, of course, the Pope is one thing on immigration, and there's things that have to be done as far as the country goes that the Pope's not really speaking from the chair of Peter when he's saying it. He's just got an opinion on it. How should that affect the Vice President's conscience?
Yeah, thanks. So this actually a complex question. It involves a number of things: the authority of the magisterium, the nature of conscience, public policy. All these things can come into play. Let me touch on a few of those. So first of all, let's talk about conscience and the Catholic doctrine on conscience. An individual Catholic has an absolute, there's no negotiation about this at all, an absolute duty to follow his conscience. Absolute duty to follow his conscience. To disobey conscience, Martin Luther, who was not a Catholic, he left the Catholic Church, but he said a very Catholic thing, which a Catholic could agree with. He once said, to disobey conscience is neither right nor safe. And he put it well. That's true. To disobey conscience is neither right nor safe. And the reason we hold that is that if you say, well, under certain circumstances you should disobey conscience, well then that you have no grounds for ever obeying any moral authority at that point. Like, the only reason I would listen to the Pope is conscience. That's it. The only reason I would follow his Scripture is conscience. The only reason I would follow sacred tradition is conscience. The only reason I would follow the natural law is conscience. If conscience doesn't bind me to some authority, because it doesn't bind, well, then all moral authority goes out the window, right?
Yeah.
So you have to obey conscience. Does that mean that conscience gives you a pass on everything? Absolutely not. And this is where, when conscience comes into public discourse, into public policy, it is so misused by people in, political ideologues, because they will take some of the most wicked positions in public life and then plead the dignity of their conscience. Well, my conscience leads me to do this, and therefore it's okay, right? Well, no, the Church never said that conscience is always correct, just that you have an obligation to follow it. So how do you balance that? If conscience can tell you to do the most dastardly things, well, you also have a moral obligation to make a genuine effort to inform your conscience, right? You have to inform your conscience. You have to really try to inform your conscience. And if you have any measure of sort of self-awareness or acumen, you recognize that I am not a good judge of my own case. I understand that I, as a human being, am prone to manipulation, to propaganda, to ideological possession, to tribalism and factionalism. I know something about confirmation bias. I understand the way I am likely to construe the data so that my side comes out on top in whatever policy or moral debate I might be engaged in. Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, has a book called The Righteous Mind, where he makes the argument, and he does this based on empirical evidence, laboratory evidence, that people don't change their moral opinions in response to argument. What they do is they form moral opinions based on their passions, and then they go looking for argument to justify what they've already antecedently decided to do. And when I read his book, I was like, yeah, well, that's what I do. Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, I know I've done that. I know everybody's done that. Right?
Yeah.
And so if you know that about yourself, then simply coming up with a warrant or a justification for what you want to do and calling it a moral argument is not the same thing as informing your conscience, right? Informing your conscience would take something. I mean, I think this is what the parables of Jesus are about. It's about taking people who are really sure in their conscience about what the right course of action is, and then forcing them hypothetically into a scenario, a narrative, where they are required to take another point of view, like the story of the Good Samaritan, for example. Here you are, you think you're a great guy because you're a priest or a Levite or whatever, and the story forces you to recognize that you're actually the bad guy in the story, right? And so, what would that look like? Well, if you're dealing with, say, immigration issues, it might mean really informing your conscience. It might involve not only, of course, studying the teaching of the church, but maybe sitting down with people who were directly affected by the immigration issue. Maybe people on both sides of the southern border. People whose lands were being entered into, and people who were doing the entering, and getting to know the human side of these issues, so that you put a human face on an ethical decision. Right? That might be an aspect of informing your conscience. Now, the magisterium. What's the magisterium's role? So you're correct that when the Pope makes a prudential intervention into policy, that he's not protected by the charism of infallibility. That doesn't mean he's not authoritative. And so the Catholic is obligated to give what is called a religious submission of mind and will to the teaching of the ordinary magisterium. And at the very least, he ought not to dispute it or dismiss it in a cavalier way, and particularly not in a public forum, right? Doesn't mean that the Pope is infallibly right on all of his political opinions. But he is authoritative, and he has a right to speak on behalf of the Catholic Church and to the moral conscience of humanity. And so if you find yourself, say, ideologically opposed to the Pope, which can happen, of course, and has in every century, and the Pope says something, I think the proper disposition for a Catholic, at the very least, particularly one in public policy, is not to immediately jump on the propaganda or ideological bandwagon and start putting down the Pope's opinion, but to take a step back and go, am I missing something here? Am I missing something here? What is the truth that he's enunciating that somehow or another I'm not incorporating into my view of issues? Now, maybe I think he's missed something. Okay, well and good. But you know what that's called? At the very least, that's called dialectic. When I'm not just engaged in a polemic with somebody to win, to score debating points and vanquish them rhetorically, but when I'm in dialogue with someone, and particularly someone who is an authority over me, because I'm genuinely seeking after the truth of the matter, and not just trying to win or score political points. And of course, this is exceedingly hard for politicians to do.
Ed, thanks so much for your call. Glad that you checked in from West Virginia. And that opens up a line for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. You're talking about conscience just now. And we got a call from Sammy. Sammy couldn't stay on the line, but says, Dr. Anders, I've been wondering this for years. I am scrupulous, And my spiritual director has defined it as when emotion doesn't line up with reason. As such, he has directed me to sometimes disregard my conscience. How do I line this up with what you're saying about always following conscience?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So conscience is a judgment of the practical reason. Okay, that's what it is. It's forming the judgment. I ought to do this in this circumstance.
Yeah, and
it depends on rational processes. It is possible for your rational processes to be hijacked and to become dysfunctional in really egregious ways. Now, if you know that about yourself, if you know that there's a glitch in the system, and this is a habitual problem of yours, then what you do is you say, well, under these certain circumstances, I know that the practical reason is not functioning. Mm-hmm. And so the conclusion, like there's you have to kind of take a third-person point of view of yourself. You have to be able to have enough sort of detachment from your circumstances to step back and look and examine your own reasoning and say, like, under a restricted set of circumstances, I know that my practical reasoning is breaking down and that it's not forming good conclusions. And so there'd be first thoughts, second thoughts, third thoughts. But someplace back there up the chain, like third thoughts recognize that second thoughts are not going right. Like there's be like conscience and superconscious, if you follow me.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And at that point, if you know that you're not forming rational judgments, then the rational thing to do would be to surrender this particular decision to someone whose judgment you trust. That's not surrendering conscience. That's not abandoning conscience. Mm-hmm. That's trying to overcome what you recognize as a fault, as a glitch in your own practical reasoning. In a similar way, like, I might have I'm just making this up off the fly, I might have a really strong sort of cultural, familial, historical bias towards, say, I don't know, a particular way of curing an illness. Maybe there's something that's handed down from folklore in my culture, and like to violate that taboo like really makes me feel weak in the knees, okay? And yet there's another part of my brain that knows, you know what, there's just absolutely no experimental basis for that. There's no rational warrant, scientific basis for that. And the scientific establishment, the medical establishment says this other thing is the right thing to do. And I know Grandmom said never do that other thing, but I'm just going to have to go with the authority on this. So like an appeal to authority can be a rational decision, right? And that doesn't mean you're not renouncing your own reason. You're renouncing sort of like bad habit and cognitive biases and prejudice and superstition. And it just feels right because it's familiar.
Well, our phone screener, Matt, says that Sammy is put off by how romantic Faustina and Therese are, and Sammy wants to know, is there a way that you get around that romanticism? Okay,
so is this a question that we've got coming up?
No, this is continuing with Sammy, who is scrupulous.
Oh, okay.
That's what's bothering her, the romanticism of Saint Faustina and Saint Therese.
Okay. Am I put off by the romanticism of Faustina and Therese?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, sir, absolutely, I can deal with that. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so let me talk about mystics and visionaries for a minute.
Okay.
All right, in the Catholic tradition. And writers on Catholic spirituality and theologians that deal with spiritual writing, they've all acknowledged this, that the style of spiritual writing and the style of theology are two very different things. The language of theology, the language of spirituality are different. And when you deal with spiritual writers in the Catholic tradition, so people have their little ways, right? And I don't mean that as a dig on St. Teresa. I mean, like, they have their little ways, you know? And like if you read Ignatius of Loyola, he'll give you his system. If you read Francis de Sales, he'll give you his system. If you read Teresa of Avila, she'll give you her system. If you read John of the Cross, he'll give you his system. And you read enough of this stuff, after a while, you start to realize, wait a minute, they're not giving me the same system. And they'll often preface it with, like, here is the surefire 100% certain way to achieve holiness. Do this on Monday and do this on Tuesday and do this on Wednesday. And you realize, okay, I can do that. I can do that. That's a regime. I can follow it. I can't follow all of them because they give me contradictory things to do.
Yeah.
And then what you find out is, this is idiosyncratic. Some of this is idiosyncratic to the saints' personality because this is what they did and it worked for them. You have to kind of get underneath it to the heart and soul of it, and I'll come back to that after the break.
Very good. We will also talk with Christy in Venice, Florida. Lots more straight ahead here on Call to Communion. Do give us a call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986.
EWTN Radio is growing. Are you an experienced radio producer looking for an opportunity to help forward Mother Angelica's mission of evangelization? We need a passionate, multi-skilled, talented professional who can manage all aspects of producing world-class radio programming. You could be the newest member of the EWTN radio family. If this is you or someone you know, email a resume and cover letter, including salary requirements, to EWTN.com/employment.
This is John Lewis in Rome. Join me for the latest news from the Eternal City on Vatican Insider, Saturday night, 9 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
This is a Did You Know moment with Sandra McDevitt. Did you know why clergy serving in the military are called chaplains? St. Martin of Tours, a soldier, was passing a beggar in the dead of winter. He stopped to give half his cloak to the freezing man. After St. Martin's death, his cloak became a sacred banner. The remaining half of his cloak, or chap in French, was preserved in a chapel where soldiers went to pray, hence chapel. The soldier in charge of the holy chap, or cape in English, was called a chaplain. On November 11th, the feast of St. Martin of Tours, we pray for all serving in the military, past and present, and all military chaplains. So now you know it was because of St. Martin of Tours and his chap. We call clergy serving in the military chaplains. I'm Sandra McDevitt for EWTN Radio.
The Global Catholic Network.
This is EWTN Radio.
On Monday's Take Two with Jerry and Debbie, our topic will be whom or what are you praying for? And now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Glad you're with us for the Friday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. All right, I'm now going to appeal to Mary, untire of knots. David knows where I'm going with this because the question that we posed just before the break was actually meant for Christy in Venice, Florida. We're about to go to her on the phone right now. But all that about Therese and Faustina, that was actually regarding Christy. So, Mary, untire of knots, please pray for me. Christy, what's on your mind today?
Hi there. Thank you so much for taking my call. And that was really helpful, what you said about St. Faustina. And basically, I would just dovetail on Dr. David Anders. I really relate to your approach to the Catholic faith. I know you came from a Protestant background, and there is such a clarity and gorgeousness to Bible alone. Although we both don't believe in that, we believe that the magisterium and tradition is what informs Scripture and tells us how to interpret it and guides us in that way. So it's necessary, but we're not questioning the magisterium at all and its necessity to even understand Scripture. But what I'm saying is, along with like the Faustina and all of that, I appreciate those genres, but I find them baroque and heavy and oftentimes oppressive in trying to just kind of navigate my own crystal clear Catholic life. And I'm wondering, what is your personal belief about revelations that tend to speak for Jesus, that are saying that these are the words that speaking to them? What are you? And again, I I respect what everyone needs as far as their personal private revelation and so forth. But for me, I find that a little bit disingenuous and a little bit weird and a little bit overly romantic when I start having even wonderful saints speaking for Jesus. And how do you deal with that? What is your opinion?
Yep. I'm right there with you. And one of the most liberating things I learned when I was sort of becoming Catholic and growing as a Catholic was that I didn't have to believe every alleged private revelation, and I didn't even have to believe or adhere to approved private revelations that have a large veneration and following throughout the world, and that I don't have to believe that they're of supernatural origin. I don't have to implement their advice. I don't have to practice the spiritualities that they enjoin. I don't have to do any of that. And if there's an approved one, then what I can't do is say, well, no one should follow that, because that's obviously false.
Right.
That's obviously false. But I think what the prudent thing to do is to say, whatever was the case of their supernatural origin or otherwise, they're all highly contextualized, right? And so, if you believe that Our Lady showed up in Fatima in 1917 or whatever it was, it was in 1917, and it was to Portuguese children, right, in 1917. And she spoke in a very particular historical moment, in a very particular historical idiom. And I think that's really important to understand, right? And not to necessarily universalize that as if it were Scripture, right? Because it's not. It's not meant to be taken that way. And one is not obligated to believe that visionaries, even if what they saw was veridical, were accurate reporters. One is not obligated to believe that, right? One can believe that visionaries made mistakes. All that kind of stuff. One can believe that visionaries incorporated elements of their own personality. I mean, all of these kind of qualifications are allowable. And at the end of the day, when it comes to optional spiritualities in the Catholic faith, they're optional. And my attitude towards spiritualities, and look, the sort of private devotions and I should say private revelations and the devotions that they engender, is just one very narrow slice of what Catholic spiritualities look like. Sort of the paradigm for spirituality as a discipline is something much, in Latin Catholicism, is something much more like Benedictine monasticism, which is about as far removed from visionary experience as you can get. I mean, I would encourage you, you don't have to become a Benedictine, but go read the Benedictine rule, right? And it's like, work 8 hours in the day, pray with people, eat sparingly. They used to get a pound of bread and a henna of wine. That was the daily allotment for your Benedictine monk. I once did the math on that and figured it came to about 1,500 calories. So not a whole bunch. Supplement with some vegetables, meat every once in a while on special holidays. Get together with your confreres once a week and let other people tell you what you're doing wrong. And be humble about it, and learn to settle your differences and don't quarrel and try to imitate the charity of Jesus. I mean, and it's a very human rule that gets all down into your embodied experience and the kind of things that actually lead us into sin and selfishness on a daily basis. And it's a program for trying to, I heard Father Anthony one time here at the network talk about religious life is like, he was Father Guardian of the Franciscans at the time, and he saw himself as like holding a leather bag with a bunch of smooth stones in it. And every time he got a new vocation, it's like taking a rough, hard edge stone and throwing it in the sack and then shaking it and shaking it and shaking it and shaking it for years until that one's hard edges get smoothed off. And then you get another and throw it in there and you shake it and you shake it and you shake it. Nothing romantic or esoteric about it at all. It's like just the daily warp and woof of sort of, rubbing elbows with other human beings and having to deal with somebody else's squeaky boots all the time that wears the hard edges off of your own selfishness and makes you become a gentle, more humane individual. And that's the heart and soul of monasticism right there. Nothing visionary or esoteric about it at all, right? Or you take something like the spirituality of Ignatius of Loyola. was totally different. It's totally different, all right? But what is it based on? Well, it's based on, well, first of all, a kind of rigorous application of the Gospels to one's life, thinking about the life of Jesus and Mary and the apostles and saying, well, how could I do that? How could I be that kind of person that follows Christ with that kind of intensity? And maybe I should put myself in the scenes of the Gospels and imagine myself one of Jesus's first disciples, and in that way I might deepen my own vocation, whether that be a religious life or marital life or whatever it might be. And then he has some pretty sound principles for, okay, when stuff bubbles up in your interior life, what do you do with it? What should I listen to? What should I dispense with? And you'll find that his criteria for discerning works of the Spirit are not esoteric at all. They're pretty darn practical, and they sound like pretty good common sense, And Teresa of Avila, who is kind of the mystic of mystics, and people read Teresa, and she had extraordinary experiences, and so they think, well, to be a Carmelite, I should have extraordinary experiences. But they weren't reading Teresa when they came to that conclusion, because when she talks about that kind of thing, she says, well, that's pretty much all nonsense, right? That the extraordinary experiences are not the point. And there's one beautiful passage in the Interior Castle where she talks about some of her sister nuns that considered themselves to go into rapture. And the Spanish word she uses for rapture it rhymes with the word for foolishness, and she makes a joke out of it and says, they call it rapture, but I call it foolishness, because all they're doing is ruining their health and making fools of themselves, right? And John of the Cross, who was her buddy, of course, said that the more you want to draw close to Christ, the more you should flee all those kinds of elevated states and exotic experiences, because they partake more of the senses and of the body, and and of sensuality, and that what you want is the ability to crucify your will, to say no to passion, to follow right reason, and ultimately to follow the example of Christ. And so, and there are these and 100 other spiritualities in the Catholic tradition. And one time when I was doing a lot of research into nutrition for my own health, I read this fellow who was posed the question as a doctor, green vegetables are good for you. What's the healthiest way to cook them? And his answer was, the healthiest way to cook them is the way that will get you to eat the most of them. And that's kind of how I feel about spirituality, that the best spirituality is the one best suited to your personality to help you be more like Christ. And the concept of having a personal relationship with Jesus is so popular, and so that language is so common. It's evangelical Protestant language, but it's sort of flown into Catholicism. And for many people, that means, well, I'm on a chatty first-name basis with Jesus, and, I talk to him about my day and my problems, and he tells me what color to paint the kitchen, right? And I think that's a wrong-headed way of looking at it. And that lends itself to that kind of like, I'm going to hear a voice in my head, and that's Jesus talking to me, and yada, yada, yada. No, I think the Catholic way to understand relationship to Christ is it's the relationship of clay to a mold. The fathers would say it's the relationship of iron to fire. You stick iron in the fire, if you hold it there long enough, it starts to glow and take on the character of the fire. Yeah. That's the relationship that you want to Jesus. It's obeying his teaching. It's imitating his example. It's interiorizing his divine personality so that you come to see the world through Christ's eyes. And I love that quote. That's a quote from Pope Francis. I think it's fantastic. You come to see the world through Christ's eyes. So you come to see the poor the way he sees them. You come to see the marginalized the way he sees them. You come to see yourself the way he sees you, right? And all of that, none of that requires esoteric experiences. And in fact, esoteric experiences are often a distraction from that, because the person who has them very often becomes haughty in their own mind. And try speaking correction into the life of somebody who knows that they've heard from God. It's impossible. Yeah. Like, they don't listen to reason. Yeah. And this is why when people claim private revelation, the church is really circumspect about validating that, and most of the time doesn't. Most of the time doesn't. And when it does, again, it's really cautious about it. And what it advocates is not sort of fascination with the phenomena, but imitation of the holiness such that it's there, right? When we get to heaven, if we get there, we meet, Jesus, and he says, He's not going to say to us, blessed are you of my Father because you heard funky voices. It's because you clothe the naked and give drink to the thirsty and food to the hungry and visit the sick and the imprisoned. The spirituality that gets you to do that more is the right spirituality for you.
All right. Christy, is that helpful for you?
That is extremely helpful. Thank you so much. Extremely helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to make one last comment about Christy's remark that there was something sort of clear and beautiful and gorgeous, or compelling and gorgeous, I forgot the word she used, about the sort of the clarity of the idea of sola scriptura. And I know what she's talking about, but I don't want to leave that unaddressed. Because I think that what one finds, if one is honest, is not that Scripture is all that clear, but that the tradition from which one came was clear, right? That like when I was a Presbyterian, for example, there was a very clear interpretive tradition for understanding the Bible, and that system was handed to me as a system, right, with all the parts interlocking in a kind of harmonious construction, and it had a kind of beauty to it. I mean, Calvinism as a system, metaphysically had a kind of internal coherence and beauty that sort of had an explanation for everything in the Bible, and for that matter, everything in human life, and that's deeply attractive, right? The problem was that at the end of the day, I think it was quite artificial. I think it was a human construct that was laid on top of the Bible that distorted what the Bible actually said. And if you take off the confessional lenses, and you sort of allow yourself to, say, read biblical criticism produced by people from other traditions and no tradition, you begin to find out pretty quick that the Bible by itself is a very complicated book, and it doesn't lend itself to the kind of sort of monolithic, systematic approach that's imposed on it by fundamentalists or Calvinists or Baptists or whoever. And but I know how comforting it is to be in a system like that, and to feel like I have a lock on reality, because my pastors and my teachers and everybody's of one mind, and they all sort of see the thing the same way, and so I become blind to the parts of the system that don't actually fit. But when you start recognizing those parts of the system that don't fit, you run into cognitive dissonance, and it can become very disorienting. And then, of course, the people around you tell you that you're giving up on faith, and they make it seem like an evil thing, right? And then you feel guilty, and then you shut down the critical part of your mind, and you kind of jump back into fundamentalist dogmatism again for the comfort that it brings. But it's not true to reality, and the text itself is actually a lot more complicated than that. At least, in my judgment, the Catholic faith has the honesty to step back and go, you know what, the Bible actually is a difficult book. It actually is a difficult book.
Yeah.
And history shows that people who believe naively in its simplicity are likely to go off half-cocked, and have done so historically over time, and made judgments about it that have turned out to be false and ultimately harmful.
Call to Communion here on EWTN. I'm so glad that you are with us on this Friday afternoon. Here's something you may want to check out this weekend. A lot of folks really enjoy listening to old-time radio shows, radio dramas or comedies where you've got a complete orchestra playing. Maybe there's somebody doing sound effects live just off stage, and here comes the announcer. He's wearing a tuxedo. Fabulous thing. Well, we bring those back for you each and every weekend. It is family theater, classic radio, some of the best of the golden age of radio. Check it out Sunday night at 11:30 p.m. Eastern, 8:30 Pacific on EWTN Radio. They are wonderful to behold, with an all-star cast, I might add to that. Back to the phones now. Here is Julie near Lansing, Michigan, listening on the EWTN app. Hey, Julie, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hi. I thought the guy I was talking to was going to relay my question. But anyway, I'm doing fine. How are you?
Doing very well. What's on your mind today, Julie?
Just a question. You were talking earlier. I was interrupted, so I didn't hear everything. But you said something about the dualism, and that we were not here before. We were on this earth, and we're only a body, and that's all we have. So I haven't been with the church for a long time, but I just remember hearing that God knew who we were before we were ever born.
Oh, yeah. You're correct about that. So like you said, you missed part of the call. Let me put it in context. So I didn't say that God didn't know us before we were born. Absolutely not. No. I didn't say that at all. What I said is that the human soul doesn't pre-exist the body, right? So the Catholic doctrine is that we're not just a body. And I didn't say we were just a body. I said you are your body. I never said you were just your body. The Catholic position is that the human person is a body-soul unity, like we're a single organism that is a body-soul unity, right? And just like you have different physical parts in you, you're not just a heart or a liver or a kidney. You're like heart, liver, and kidney and all the rest of it. Well, you're heart, liver, kidney, and soul, right? And so the soul is part of what you are, but it doesn't pre-exist the body. The soul comes into existence at the same time as the physical body. The Catholic doctrine is that God infuses an immaterial and immortal soul into the human body at the moment of conception. Now, God creates the soul at the moment of conception. So what I was asked about, and maybe you missed this part of the call, there have been people in history who imagined that God created a kind of storehouse of souls, and that, there's this independently existing thing called a soul floating around in some lockbox in heaven, and then, God sees, well, there's a new human being about to exist. I'll reach into my storehouse and grab one of these soul things and then drop it down there and slap it into a human being, right?
Ooh.
And that's not the Catholic position. It was, however, the position. I don't know if you saw the Pixar movie Soul.
No, I've not seen that one.
It's a cute movie, but it's based on terrible metaphysics.
Uh-oh.
Right? So very bad metaphysics, very bad ontology. And in that film, souls are thought of as little Casper the Ghost-looking things that live in some sort of Empyrean heaven and wait for a human body to drop into. And then the human body is coming on the scene, and they jump into it, and then off they go, right? That's the position we're ruling out. That's what I said the Catholic Church denies.
Okay.
Not that God doesn't know us. Sure, God knows the future, and so God knows from all eternity that he's going to make you, Julie, right? Someplace near Lansing, Michigan in the 21st century. God knows that, of course, from all eternity and has you in his mind.
There you go. Julie, thanks so much for your call. Glad we could clarify that for you. Sherry is in DeSoto, Missouri. Is Sherry? Sherry may not be quite ready just yet, so we'll hold off on that. Do you remember a couple of days ago, we got an email from someone named Lavender?
Yes,
I do.
I do. And I talked about Gordon Lightfoot.
Well, guess what?
Is she a Gordon Lightfoot fan?
David and Tom, my name is from the Gordon Lightfoot song.
Hot dog.
Like you referenced on your show, David, Approaching Lavender. She goes on to say, I grew up in the 80s and 90s listening to folk music, probably the only healthy thing about my childhood. That is so funny. Yeah, that's great.
So that song was a real important part of my courtship of my wife.
Yeah. Well, very good. Now we're ready for Sherry in DeSoto, Missouri, listening on the Great Covenant Network. Hey, Sherry, what's on your mind today? Sherry in DeSoto, are you there?
I am.
Go right ahead.
Hi. So my question was, I'm in OCIA, but I'm not Catholic yet.
Okay.
But for Ash Wednesday, I don't know. I am baptized already. So I don't know. Would I be able to receive ashes?
Absolutely,
on Ash Wednesday,
yes.
Or do I have to be confirmed?
No. You can douse yourself in ashes. Absolutely. Come get ashes. Absolutely. You're totally welcome to get ashes.
A lot of non-Catholics receive ashes.
That's true.
On Ash Wednesday.
That's true.
I think it's a cool thing.
Hey, it's the happening thing.
That's
Come
right.
on down, get your ashes.
Sherry, you're going to be in with the in crowd. There you go. Thanks so much for checking in from Missouri. Here's a question now from Sue, who says, I was taught that it's a mortal sin to miss Sunday or Saturday or a holy day of obligation Mass. But on your program, I thought I heard you say we're only required to attend Mass once a year. Did I mishear that?
You misheard that. So what I said was you're only required to receive Holy Communion once a year.
Big difference.
The Code of Canon Law says you have to go to Holy Communion once a year. You can go to Mass. You have to go to Mass every Sunday and Holy Day of Obligation. And you might be scratching your head and think, well, why would I go to Mass and not go to communion? But remember that frequent communion, weekly communion, was not the norm for large periods of Catholic history. And so when the canon in 1215, which is the Fourth Lateran Council that said you have to go to communion once a year, when that canon was written, at that time, the common practice was for Catholics to go to Mass and not go to communion.
That's right.
It wasn't until the pontificate of Pius X that the Catholics in the West were encouraged to participate in frequent communion. And you might say, well, why is that, Anders? Well, the reason why is that, first and foremost, the Mass is a sacrifice offered to God. And one should be in a state of purity to make that sacrifice. And just like the Old Testament priests had to be ritually pure, the Christian has to be morally pure. And in previous eras, Catholics were very sensitive to the thought that, well, I really want to make sure I'm right with God before I do this thing. I'm participating in very holy rites here. I don't want to take it in a cavalier way. And, it's possible to press that, concern to the point of scrupulosity, and maybe we did for a while. But you can go the other way, too, and get too lax. People can take communion in a sort of casual way, sort of despise the sacredness of the thing and involve themselves in sacrilege. And that's exactly the thing that the Church was trying to avoid by not having people go to communion all that often. And the same canon that says you had to go to communion once a year says you have to go to confession at least once a year. And so, again, if you were to go back, say, to the days of St. John Vianney in 18th century France, in 19th century France, what you'd find is that people would go to confession prior to their Easter communion, and it was a big deal. It was a big deal. The Easter confession and the Easter communion were a big deal. And in fact, a lot of the sermons of St. John Vianney are about this. They're about, people would get upset with him because they would go to confession to him, and he'd say, well, I'm not going to give you absolution and communion unless you agree to give up this, and this.
Ooh.
And they were like, but look, Father, if I don't go to communion, my mother's going to kill me. You got to let me come to communion. He's like, I will let you come to communion, but you got to give up this, and this. And they're like, well, the priest down the road doesn't make me give up that to go to communion. He's like, I'm not the priest down the road.
That's on him.
I'm the priest right here. And you got to give up this, and this. And it was a big deal. And he would, John Vianney would kind of get down into your business. And he'd be like, I see you go a lot of gambling these days. And you were over at the saloon way too many times. And
wow,
you were dancing kind of a lewd dance the other night. You got to give all that up. He was kind of had a little puritanical streak about him, St. John Vianney. And you're like, and they were like, oh, dude, man, I'm going to the next parish. I don't like this guy.
And yet, it was St. John Vianney who had the lines around the church.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Because they loved it because they knew he was giving them that medicine.
That was not meant to be a criticism of him at all. It was just a description of the regime and the fact that he took it very seriously. And those that wanted to get close to God found that he was the priest to go to.
Yeah.
And he was extremely patient with people in the confessional. They would come from all over France for him to hear their confessions. And he could read souls, too, and be like, okay, you're up to this.
Yeah. Padre Pio was very similar.
Yeah, he was.
The lines formed and just wrapped around the building in some cases. Wow, there you go. Thank you so much for that question. Dr. David Anders, have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Tom.
Don't forget, we do this program Monday through Friday here on EWTN Radio. If you're new to EWTN, maybe you're new to the Catholic faith, check us out each and every Monday through Friday. You can also check us out via podcasting. Go to EWTN.com/radio. And then once you're there on that radio homepage, look for the words Podcast Central. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Thank you so much. Hope that you have that great weekend as well. We'll see you Monday right here on EWTN's Call to Communion. God bless.
Hi, this is Doug Keck, inviting you to join me next time when our special guest